We'll put the note out. Okay, I'm going to go on LinkedIn now. Okay.
The mirroring is funny. The non-mirroring is funny. It's like,
yeah,
that's me the other way around.
Yeah. Okay. We get a lot of folks interested in this particular, a lot of
great.
This topic, I think, seems to resonate. So it looks like
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I did get a few new folks that I don't know reaching out.
Really?
Even since you posted. Yeah. So yeah.
I'm always surprised that people I'm like, oh, people watched it and they respond and they got
people saw something.
It's really happening. Yeah. It's interesting because I think it's I track accelerators as a hub. I track about 1,000 of them.
That's awesome.
Building a bigger database, and I've worked with them for about a decade. So just seeing the growth in the space and the transition, it's because the ecosystem has grown to the point where you have to now kind of vet and assess the services that are provided within the ecosystem. Right, it's gotten big enough to require that, and so that was really the impetus of this. Is because accelerators are oftentimes like the gatekeepers to innovation in a state or city or country. And so it became more important to understand who was running these accelerators and what were they looking for, how are they understanding the market, because they're tying into all these other ecosystems now in a way that has just bigger implications than it used to have. And so it became an interesting topic. So it was really funny. I was talking to someone the other day on the interview, and they were like, well, I'm just happy to talk to you because you talk to all these accelerators and I'd love to learn a couple of things about accelerators. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't realize that was a thing. But
you made it a thing. That's great.
Yeah, they even the one, and what you're doing is similar. Even for the folks who lead the work, they're still looking to learn from others who are doing the work, right?
And there's this kind of lonely feeling, right?
Yeah.
It's important to do, but none of the stakeholders really get what you're trying to do, and pulling the different sides together, and it helps really to talk to someone else in the same position.
It really does. Yeah, exactly. So this is, and corporate is a huge issue because everyone's getting pushed toward, sell to enterprise, and no one knows how to do that. And it's not even, it's like a misnomer in itself. If that's how everyone should kind of grow businesses and what's happening inside corporates. And there's just so much there. So it is such a huge part of the market. I'm super excited. So, okay, we're going to start. I'm going to do a quick intro.
Great.
So, hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Accelerator Insider, where we talk to the folks behind incubators, accelerators, and innovation studios, supporting the next wave of business growth for today. I'm so excited to have Diana Joseph, the CEO of the Corporate Accelerator Forum, here joining us today. Hi, Diana.
Hi. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation. I came across your work on LinkedIn, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing because it's just, this is the conversation. I work with a lot of different accelerators and a lot of different tech stars and so on. And I was mentoring for a couple of companies, and the biggest thing they're asking is I'm trying to get into these corporates and enterprises. How do I do it? What does it look like? And so this was so timely. I think it's probably kind of one of those forever times. It doesn't lose its relevancy in the market, but I think you've captured something really unique. So I'm really excited to talk to you about that today. And maybe we can just start, people can Google you, they can go on the website. We'll talk about that and LinkedIn. But I just want to talk a little bit about your background in the space, because it's a little bit of a closed door thing. It's not easy to get into corporate innovation as a category, as a job, as a function. And it looks like you started that work at Adobe, and then you started doing it more formally at Citrix. I just want to kind of hear, what was your journey and how did you move into that space?
Thank you for framing the question that way. I really want to give you the whole story, because I was so far away from any of this. And I actually had to do some reflection, how did I get here? It is possible to get, probably wherever you want to go, but it's certainly possible to get into this space. I started actually as an academic.
Yeah.
I'm a learning scientist by training. Learning sciences is an interdisciplinary field where we think about how people learn. And given how we think learning works, what should learning experiences look like?
Oh.
online or in the real world. What should that look like? So as an academic, I had two big areas of interest. One was around motivation and learning, particularly self-determination and learning. So how do our different goals and incentives and desires determine what we're able to learn and how we're able to learn? Mm-hmm. And in order to study that, I needed different methodologies, right? Traditional social science methods say that you can't change anything, right? You go in and you watch and you try to make sense. You can have quantitative tools and qualitative tools, but what your job is to watch and interpret. Mm-hmm. And in learning sciences, we really needed to try things. We're trying to build learning environments. And if you're going to do that, you need a different way of, if you're going to push on the environment, you need a way to pay attention to that. So we needed a way to track our iterations. We needed a way to clarify when and why we changed our intentions. And so that was the second big area is methodology. We built an approach, or helped to articulate an approach called design-based research. Mm-hmm. So with those pieces in mind, when my children were very small, it started to make sense. That was all in Chicago, Northwestern University, University of Chicago. And when my children were small, we wanted to come out to California. It just made lots of sense for personal reasons. And Adobe, to my surprise, was looking for something like a learning scientist. Mm-hmm. And we had not really seen that in industry before. We see it all the time now. But at the time, really what happened is that one of my master's student colleagues was working at Adobe, and she recognized that they needed a learning scientist. And so I came out to Adobe. It was right at the beginning of the move to the cloud. And at the time, you will not remember this, but you used to have to go to the store to buy software. And it came in a really big fat box. And the size of the box does not justify the amount of data that in the software. It's a book. There's a fat book in there. And that's how you learn to use the software. So there was this army of writers who were Adobe employees, and their job was to basically interview the engineers, understand how to use the software, and then put that in a book. But if you're moving to the cloud, a book makes no sense because you're going to be changing all the time. And also, it's in the cloud. So you have access to the entire world of Adobe educators and people who are producing content. So those writers needed to change from being writers to being curators and ethnographers and understanding, almost learning scientists. What does our community need to learn? So I ran the research arm of that, qualitative, quantitative. How can these writers understand what's going on and make good decisions about it? So it was very interesting. I learned a lot about change management. Adobe was a really good company. And while I was there, I got exposed to we're getting to the story, I promise.
I'm like, what? Tell me more. Go ahead.
So I got exposed to their internal innovation program, which is called Kickbox. Are you familiar with it at all? It's kind of gotten out in the world, in the corporate world to some extent. So it was created by this amazing, charismatic leader, Mark Randall, who was the VP of creativity. And he was an acquired entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. And so he'd come into corporate with this entrepreneurial DNA. And he learned about lean startup, this kind of big innovation methodology, and it blew his mind. And he started doing these trainings. So this 3-day thing, he's amazing. He's like weeping about innovation, very moving. And then at the end of this intense 3 days, where your Adobe employees are invited to explore, to kind of get the toolkit to explore an idea, you get this box. It's a bright red cardboard box, and inside there's coffee and sticky notes and Sharpies and a timer. There's a little book for your bad ideas. There's all kinds of good innovation tooling in there, and there's a credit card, and the credit card has $1,000 pre-approved on it, and that was amazing to me because, I was not enough on the front line of the organization. I was a level or two up from the front line. I didn't have a budget. My boss didn't have a budget. I don't think her boss had a budget. That inside a giant corporation, often you have to be a general manager before you really have a budget that you're responsible for making decisions about. Everybody else has to ask for everything. They may have some kind of approval level, but basically you have to justify every dollar you spent. And with this credit card, what Mark was saying was, look, you're an Adobe employee. You've already been vetted. Surely you have lots of really good ideas. Yeah. Here's a little bit of resources for you. Go explore. And if it turns out to be important, let us know. And if it turns out not to be important, don't waste our time telling us about it. Yeah. So there was not only no reporting burden, but we were forbidden from any type of time wasting, right? Mm-hmm. And that gesture of trust resonated for me really deeply with this idea of self-determination and learning. The idea that we were set free from the idea that someone else could tell us what was interesting, what was important to the organization. We were being given our strategic minds back. So I was like, okay, great. So I have this idea I'm pursuing. It's really cool. That would be fun. Actually, I want to work on this. So I tried to go work for him. And he explained to me very gently what lean meant in lean startup, that he did not see how I would possibly be of help to him. And so I left. I went to Citrix. I followed a graduate school colleague there. And my job there at the beginning was to teach design thinking. So another big innovation methodology, and to teach the whole company. The intention was for Citrix to become a human-centered organization, which is hard to do when you're talking about enterprise hardware and software engineering stuff. And so that was the idea. We're all going to become human-centered. And we started to do that work. We had a wonderful consultant, and we learned a lot. And I got to go to D school at Stanford and learn from the origin. And it was great. We had these really fun boot camps, and people would, the sky would open up and people would have these epiphanies, right? But then they would go back to work and they couldn't do it.
Right.
And they didn't know why they couldn't do it. And so we wanted to understand why. And that's when I started working with the Citrix Startup Accelerator. That was my exposure to startups. And that is where I sort of got the idea that we could pursue this idea. We could pursue the self-determination concept, which I now say everybody needs to be more entrepreneurial.
Yep.
And so that's...
This is super interesting. I mean, it just hits on, I think a little bit about self-determination. I think about the grit work that was done.
Oh, yes.
Kind of has some similar nodes, and I think people hear self-determination and they get all sorts of other emotional responses to that, because I think of the use of the country. But I think there is something, the challenge, I think, is that the entrepreneurial DNA, which, you ask folks, like, do you want to be an entrepreneur or not? And that's like, and they're like, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But if you ask people, like, do you want to create your own reality? Do you want to, lifestyle design and all those things? That's it. Yeah, 100%, 100%. Right. I want, right. And so, and that really is what the self-determination is about. It's really that unlocking of, well, can you self-evolve? Can you work through all the hurdles of your life to basically create what you want? Right. That's, and I think oddly, entrepreneurship is tied to that because of this underlying, I think, quietly understood reality of that change is really risky. And so entrepreneurs have just less risk averse. They can take on risk. They have a better appetite for it. And something about change and risk kind of go hand in hand. So also you have this narrative that self-determination is very similar.
Yes. Yeah. We are very much on the same page. I think about being entrepreneurial as having two muscles that should be our evolutionary legacy. We should be good at both of these things. And one of them is risk appetite, taking initiative, solving problems. we should be very good at that because, you know, we're predators. We got to go figure out where the stuff is, right? But at the same time, we're also flock animals. We should also be very good at alignment and finishing things on time and doing things together. We should be good at both of those things. School helps us a lot with one of those things. And it really, for people who did super well in school, and I will admit to that, right? I was really into doing well in school. And I think it tends to atrophy that initiative muscle. And so when people are when you're asking somebody, like, do they want to be entrepreneurial? Like, how would they even begin? It can be really hard to think about, well, what would I make? And what would be the first step? And how would I get through all the stack of problems that I see?
Right.
So it's fun to open up that possibility.
And we'll talk about this a little bit. We talk about the corporate accelerator. You know, I was an EIR for National Grid, and so worked kind of internally to help them with some of their innovation and commercialization work. And you know, part of it is like, maybe I don't self-identify as an entrepreneur. Like I remember, you know, I mean, a little bit younger than you, but still, I was, you know, I never, until I turned like maybe 30, I never called myself an entrepreneur. I was like, I like to build things. Like,
right.
So you think about that from the perspective of an employee, someone who's been doing the work for many, many years, who thinks they're creative, who thinks, right, but they don't have the risk appetite. They're like, well, I don't really want to be that. I want to create. I want to feel fulfilled, right? I want to feel my work matters. I want to have legacy. But entrepreneur, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a little, maybe, I don't know if you see that when you go into corporate spaces, that tension between the identity and the
Definitely. And I do think it hinges on risk, like you were saying. And there's I think, a big misunderstanding, which is the idea that if you do what you're already doing, that's not risky. If you just stay the course, that's not risky, right? It feels safe because I know how to do it. But we're in an environment where things are changing really, really fast. So what are the odds? You know, there's plenty of people who continue to do exactly what they're doing every day, do everything right, do exactly what they're called upon for. And then things change anyhow, right?
That's
so
a mind-blowing statement. I'm going to put that in. No, it really is, because it's like the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And you don't
exactly
limit it, so you don't recognize it as risky or not risky or whatever, because you're in it.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that changes the definition of what it is functionally.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it puts us into uncertainty, which is, I think, we're even worse at than risk, right? Because risk, all right, well, I can whip out my actuarial table and I can calculate the risk and I can make a decision what I want to take on. Uncertainty is like, this is a gray fog. I have no idea what's coming next. How do I even where is the first stepping stone? And it does take some courage. It makes sense that we would have feelings about that.
So as people orgs in a world where we consider businesses people, and you know, I just you know, you're talking about a lot of really deep personal things that come to bear in a corporate environment.
Yeah.
Where there's this like pretend separation of church and state, right, happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't exist. I think that'll be the most, you know, not most, but a high level of enlightenment for most people, to recognize that when you're in a company, you are the company. And when you do bad customer service and you think it doesn't reflect you or the company, it completely does. They are synonymous, because you have chosen when you're an expression of the thing, right? And that's right. Identity is closer and closer. And I think that's really hard for people to understand those things. But you're talking a lot about this interrelationship of like the personal identity with the corporate identity, and finding meaning and value in both to create something better, hopefully, for the world through innovation.
Here, Dominique.
The work.
Yes, the work.
Yes, it is the soul. It is the soul work, right? It's that merger, right? And I think there's 85 versions of the narrative of singularity, but a lot of it is really that internal singularity to the external, right? And I think innovation is this weird space that does that. It like brings that to bear, to your point of people having these like aha moments when they're doing innovation work in a company. And you're like, are you going? They're going through like a release of energy, and they're excited again, and they find this passion they didn't have for 10 years, and it's like, you start to see how like they've been starving their soul of that creativeness, or even if they've been something that they love, that this new way of doing it, it refreshes them, or it just kind of shakes things up and makes them like reconnect to the creative energy. So I think that, that's a lot of the work. So, okay, well, with that being said, so you did all this, moved into, and then started the Corporate Accelerator Forum in 2017. And so Adobe, Citrix, 2017, lean startups in the world. I used to train on lean startup like all over the country. So like
awesome.
Very familiar. Within the world, it's kind of hit like a tipping point.
Yeah.
I think that's right. IDO has come out. Everyone's doing, whatever. What was it like going into corporates at that time? Were they like, yes, right now? Were they still like skittish? Were they like, we have our own programs internally, we want external companies? Like, what was happening in corporate at the time?
I think corporate innovation has always been a thing. Internal corporate innovation has always been a thing. So like the idea of a skunk works was in the world. Intuit was doing tons with design thinking all throughout the company. We were really trying to be leaders in that space at Citrix, and we had partner companies that were also becoming human-centered. We would get together and share all our tips and tricks and stuff. The idea of CVC was very much in the world. There were a few corporate accelerators. I think it still felt really new. So after Citrix, I took a little side trip into medical devices, and then I decided I wanted to put up a shingle. If I'm going to say everybody needs to be more entrepreneurial, I better know what that means. I better really. Academia is pretty entrepreneurial, but I wanted to say like I made something and I learned some stuff. Yeah. So I used the techniques from lean startup and design thinking, and I did customer discovery interviews and ethnographic interviews, and looked at maybe I was going to help on the personal side, people who were going back into the workforce after raising their kids or getting divorced and suddenly needed a career they never thought they needed. But then also on the industry side. And one of the people that I got to interview pretty early on was Amanda Cashin, who at the time, excuse me, was running Illumina Accelerator. Illumina is a big genomics company, and they had this accelerator that they'd been running for 2 or 3 years at that point. And here's my thought. I'm going to interview her, and she's going to buy curriculum from me, which is not how you're supposed to do customer discovery interviews. But I'm not the first person to commit that sin, and that was my idea. So it turned out not only was she not going to buy curriculum from me, she was very anti-curriculum, and I learned a lot from that conversation. But the other thing that I learned was that she was hungry to talk with other people in the same boat. And you alluded to this before. Like she's sitting there and she sees, by then the Citrix Startup Accelerator was gone. And she'd been tracking that one because it was pretty similar. It was designed in a way that was pretty similar to Illumina Accelerator. And where did it go? She had no way to find out. And so she couldn't see the landscape by herself. It was very hard to develop repeatable practices when you could only do really one cohort at a time. It takes really a long time. And she's in this odd social situation where she has her internal stakeholders who have one set of goals and expectations and timelines. And then she has her external stakeholders who are the founders of totally different goals and stakeholders and timelines. And we learned all of that I got the scent of something from her desire to talk with other folks, and then did a lot more interviews and discovered at least those 3 big areas where they wanted to talk to each other. So that's what that was a big theme that we were hearing, is this hunger to understand what the heck everybody else was doing.
Because no one still knows because it's so, people talk about like understanding market trends. And, to me, it always feels like, well, you have to just have a point of entry in which you understand that particular thing and how that thing is moved against the market to be able to understand market trends. You don't have to you have to know finance to understand market trends, but if you really know sports well and you're seeing pickleball, you can start to understand things that are happening in the market.
Well put.
And so, with with corporates, so in 2017, so this is kind of interesting too, because, I was talking to someone who used to do corporate innovation for Techstars.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and another one that does stuff for the government. And so there's a couple of different scenarios happening. You have folks that want to do commercialization of their own technology with their scientists and engineers. You have folks that are straight up doing venture. They're just investing and buying companies, whatever, for whatever reasons. And you have folks that are trying to like steward innovation
Steward innovation,
steward innovation, trying to become a space for people to build things. So you have the Samsungs, Mobiles, who are like, we want to integrate you into our stuff. We're only one of your clients, but we want to, right? And that might be like partially a marketing and branding thing, and then a partial innovation thing. And I'm like, what's all this about? Because like I'm thinking about R&D, because I'm like, wait, what's R&D to this?
Yeah.
Are they now the same thing? Are they different? And like, there's 85 ways to skin this cat. What is this about? What are you trying to get accomplished by doing all these different activities? I don't know if you have any insight on maybe why all exists, or maybe why someone would do one versus another type of program.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this so much right now. I'm working on a book about open innovation, actually, with a couple of other innovation consultants. And this is something that's really important to us. So there's some kinds of innovation that really can and should be done internally. These companies have the best scientists in the world, the best engineers in the world, and they're very creative, and they can do things internally. But also, in the nature of a corporate, especially a public corporate, but the private ones have slightly different constraints that cause the same challenges. There's things that they can't do, right? So they have required quarterly reporting, and then they give themselves some additional requirements every quarter that cause them to be very short term, right? Everybody has short-term goals they have to achieve. They're very difficult. There's not really extra time to think about things. There is a brand perception that's a huge asset that's incredibly important to the company. And if you do something that might take the brand in a different direction or might not look like it fits inside the brand, you just can't. You'll be completely stopped from doing that. You like at Citrix once, we had an idea that we wanted to try, and we wanted to do just kind of a quiet experiment, put up a website, sort of a Wizard of Oz thing, and see how many people were interested. And the legal group told us that we couldn't do it. We would have to put the brand on it. We could not do it without having it be very clear that it was a Citrix project. And the brand group told us that we could not do a project that was uncertain like that with the brand on it. So it's just an example of of a restriction that just we couldn't figure out a way around. We could have done it on our own, but we couldn't do it as Citrix employees. And I'm I'm not saying anything bad about Citrix here. It's just an example of the kind of bind that corporates are in. And so when they run into something that has that kind of bind, when they have to go out and talk to people about something that's not finished yet, or when they have to, when there's an idea that's already out in the world that they need to catch up to, there's all kinds of reasons that would drive them outside the organization. And then there's different kinds of things that you can get from different stages and different types of partners, right? So maybe you need a coalition with other giants. Maybe you need to partner with a university because the ideas that you see coming are so far out there, it's really only the academics that have the space to look at it yet. Or maybe you need to work with a startup that's really early and you want to learn with them very early and be influenced by them and be part of the journey together. Or maybe somebody's already built something that you just want to acquire, and there's a whole spectrum in between there.
Yep.
I do not think they know this, by the way. So I'm describing why you're seeing what you're seeing, but it's not a conscious process for the most part. People are making individual conscious decisions, and it's the pattern makes sense if you step back far enough.
No, I think you're spot. I mean, you're spot on as you're talking, and I'm thinking to myself, two things come very clear to me from what you share. One is, oh, that's why innovation groups exist, because they're the cover. they're the sub brand within the brand that lets them innovate without as much risk. So if I am going to work with a startup that might fail, or I want to put out a landing page, if I can do it under my, Fidelity Lab or whatever company, corporate, whatever, that gives me space to take some chances that brand wouldn't love and legal wouldn't love in other contexts. So it gives me that path. That makes sense. And that is a fundamental reason why every company should just have a lab, no matter what, just to create that intersection point, that note to everybody who listens to this. Advice you didn't ask for, but everyone should do that, right? So, and then but the second part is, you think about like the North Star. So, Dropbox, I just saw the other day, put out like some kind of, it's like job or function or whatever, basically looking for folks to help them basically rebuild and rethink the product. And to your point of where that sits, like if they want to integrate AI, and so where that sits in terms of the different service offerings, what we're starting to see is that because the landscape is so dynamic, growth's happening so quickly, that this forcing mechanism, which is just the change mechanism of whatever that curve is of exponentially increasing at the rate for technology, that is forcing people to say, well, we can't answer the question in the same way we used to answer the question. Right. And so depending on what my North Star is, whether, and that might be the year-long goal, the 2-year goal, or whatever, I have to kind of bring everything to bear that I can bring to bear to solve this problem. And so if I need to re-platform myself so I'm still relevant in 5 years, so I'm not dying a death, I think about like Asana and Trello versus, Monday and ClickUp, a simple product tool. But the difference, if you talk to a millennial or Gen Z, they're like, oh my God, Asana is so clunky. Oh my gosh. I'm like, really? Oh, it's so clunky. Yeah.
But it was so beautiful that first, like, watch me slide my tile over. Yeah.
People don't even know Basecamp anymore, but you think about Basecamp and so the question of like re-platforming and aging out, because though you become an industry standard, now it's like we don't have that many Microsofts anymore where they have all these enterprise contracts where you're going to use Power BI, you're going to use all this stuff. You have companies that are huge companies, public companies, where you're aging out of the demo. The folks that have to use this tool don't want to use this tool because they're mid-level managers, which are going to be younger people. And so now you're stuck having to redevelop and re-platform your whole thing to be, right-sized or just kind of fit for that community. And it's requiring that we take all these different risks that we're not traditionally used to taking in corporate.
And the structures make it so difficult to make that shift, right? Because if you're called upon, if your bonus, and maybe your job, but at least your bonus depends on executing every quarter, even 5 years, 5 years is just not that long.
Yeah.
Right. But even 5 years is that's 20 quarters. That's really far out to have to think about. And, I don't know that we're going to have the experience, like you say, right? People used to say, okay, well, we've got this cash cow. Even when I started, there were companies like, well, we've got this cash cow. The cash cow is going to give milk forever. It's like, is it though? We keep coming back to this theme of what you're doing now feels very familiar. We know exactly how to do it, and it's super duper risky.
Yeah.
So you're actually easing your risk by diversifying into innovation and partnership.
And what people sometimes I think people just kind of forget is like when you think about all the big household brand names that we know and recognize. I don't know the data on this on the back end, but we kind of can look at it and say, well, I know that GE has acquired tons of things that don't sit in their original thesis of what they were building and providing as a service, right? To make their business make sense. And so what you end with is brand, and your core value prop becomes less and less of the products that make up the business functionally. And so I think we kind of forget about that. And I think why innovation is kind of interesting is because it's this combination of not just knowing where my market is going if I'm a growing company, but knowing where the market might be going. Because I might need part of really adjacent or secondary to what I do, but I know I need it for the business to survive. And I think people don't always realize that that's happening. There was this panel and I think it was called like the Global Finance Panel. It's kind of an interesting group. It was like 12 people. It was like a couple heads of the large hedge funds. You had, and banks. You had someone from Goldman Sachs. You had someone from Santander there, and so on. And then you had one guy who was from the Middle East who runs a huge family fund, one of the biggest funds in the world, and he was saying how he was really lucky because he doesn't have quarterly requirements,
right?
And all the other folks are saying, the biggest challenge is the quarterly requirements. It's forcing mechanism, applying it all. How do you think right now corporates? So do you think when corporates are looking at those quarterly requirements, has this innovation work been prioritized because of the quarterly requirements, like, and what it's forcing? Or do you think it's actually making it harder to do innovation?
I think it makes it harder to do it. I think for sure it makes it harder to do innovation. One interesting story, and I hope I'll have time to dig into this. I'm doing a fireside chat with someone from Unilever on Tuesday, and we have lots of things to talk about, but hopefully we can talk about this too. At some point, they stopped doing something quarterly, and they're in Europe. Maybe they don't have the same rules here. That the SEC here requires quarterly reporting, but I don't think they require quarterly analyst calls. I think that's a choice. So don't quote me on exactly how they did it, but they released themselves from at least some of the quarterly pressures, and I think it's made a huge difference. I think
human. It's so human of us, right? It's like take away the call, and it's like it's not that the stress level goes, and we think about exactly. It's so scientific and it's so emotional. Like all of it's so emotional, right? It's like
so emotional. We're just people, yeah.
Yeah, with all these with people with big pens writing big things, and we're like, listen, this, but take away that call, and you're like, well, I put out the report, but only 10 people read it because no one wants to check their email and read the report. The call was easier. Without the call, less pressure, less conversation, less view, less visibility. Keep it moving, right?
Yeah.
It's so
yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of structures like that prevent innovation. There's it's really hard to get a job requisition. So your manager fought really hard for a very specific description of what they needed. And then you come in with this whole other set of capacities. Hi, I'm a learning scientist, right? Yeah. I can be really strategic for you. But that person fought hard to get exactly that skill set. And if they can't prove that you're doing that, then they don't get it the next time, right? So the job description, it's the hierarchy, it's the quarterly reporting, there's subtleties around taxes. There's all kinds of stuff that just make it really, really difficult. That structure is wonderful for keeping aligned and being huge, right? So there's lots of reasons for it. It's not that somebody's doing something bad, but it makes it very difficult to do certain kinds of innovation. And that's why you have to be out in the ecosystem so you can feel what's happening in the environment. And you have to be partnering so that people with a different skill set and startups have their own binds, but it's a different set of binds. So they're able to do some different things, and having the partners come together really makes a ton of sense.
And so you also work with startups through your organization. What are some of the issues that they're having working with corporates? Is it the same on both sides, or are they really unique and different?
They are unique and different. So I will say first that when you look at the pairing of the giant and the tiny organization, what I thought I was going to see is that I knew that there were breakdowns, and what I thought I was going to see is that the breakdowns are at that interface between the big and the small, like right between them. It's going to be about negotiation. It's going to be about something about that relationship. But actually, the biggest problems are inside the large organization. It's alignment inside the large organization. There's a lot of turnover in the innovation group for a variety of reasons, and therefore the person you're talking to, the person on the corporate side, is new probably, and they don't know what they don't know, so they don't know what they can say yes to and what they can't say yes to, and so you get wrong promises and misunderstandings about timelines and all kinds of stuff on the internal side. And also there are some shenanigans and mistakes on the startup side. So, and some just questions of maturity. So transparency is super important for both. And then when we look at maturity on the startup side, the first question for founders, the one that feels most important to them, is usually IP.
Yeah.
So we ask, what's your IP strategy? So it doesn't really matter what your IP strategy is, but having a very clear and confident IP strategy is important, because startups go into conversations with corporates nervous about IP, and that it's human again, right? They make everybody nervous, right? You come in like, are you going to steal my stuff? And it's just not a good way to start a conversation. But if you come in with confidence, this is what we're keeping private. These are our trade secrets. We're not going to talk about that at all. Here's what we're willing to discuss under NDA. Here are our patents. Yeah. Whatever pattern you choose to have, understanding it and being really confident in your own boundaries, right? So technology readiness level and having that be a match for the industry and the kind of stage, as we were discussing before. So those are a couple of them.
Well, I'm just, as you're saying this, I'm like, my brain is like going, it's like, because because I think that it's so so the advice, this is, for all startups out here, I'm like, oh my gosh, because I swear, like, between what angel investors tell you compared to venture capitalists tell you, compared to corporates tell you, they all have different requirements. And so you'll hear this a lot, like when you're a startup, we don't sign NDAs, we're just going to look at your stuff, it doesn't matter, right?
That's the VCs. Yeah.
That's the VCs all day. Yeah. Like, you don't need that. If you come to that, I won't even look at your like all this, which is also, I think, actually, it's a dual-sided thing, because it's a quite predatory behavior, actually, because you don't know the intention behind the VC. You don't know who else is in their fund. You don't know what else they're looking at. But at the same time, I understand why they're like, we look at thousands of things, so like it's just not going to matter. Like, I understand why they're like the time ratio. So there's like this kind of tension there. Right. But then you go to the corporate side, and you're like, no, you better have that locked in.
Yeah, and the corporates want it too. And then the person on the corporate side doesn't know what they don't know. So it becomes really valuable for the startup to know more. Yeah. So, for example, sometimes the corporate will come with an NDA that's that thick. Right. And that doesn't make any sense. The startup doesn't have time or money, but particularly time to get a lawyer to look at a thick contract. And there's no reason it has to be like that. So pushing your corporate partner to go back to legal and say, like, I know this is our standard. This is what we use for big companies. There's lots of reasons for that. This is a small company. And better yet, if the startup brings a sample 2-sided NDA, and then they can just take that to the lawyers and say, will this do?
So this is really interesting, because this again, going back to like why every company should have an innovation lab, even if they're not creating stuff, just to manage the nuances of this process. Because to your point, like when I used to, work with corporates, I would say, I'm not going to send you my contract because you're going to redline the heck out of it. I don't have time for that. Just send me what you're going to send me, and I'll just look at that. Because even though that's more time, it's going to be way easier to negotiate that and make a couple of tweaks on your doc than it is for the reverse. It's going to actually cost me tons of time and money to fix my little 2-pager that's missing everything that you needed to have. But it's like, I think about, again, like the work that they're doing at Comcast, NBC Universal, where they've been really intentional about basically building pathways inside the organization to partner with these companies, right, as part of their broader R&D innovation efforts. And so much of it is working with procurement. It's working legal, right? It's working with marketing. And so like and you could have that whole function and never have to run an accelerator, but just to have that function to be able to integrate startups into the work is necessary.
Yeah, we've seen people make little pocket fast track programs where it's just, twice a month I have lunch with a fairly senior person from legal and a fairly senior person from procurement, and we know what changes we can make, and we just push them through. There is always a decision to make on the part of the startup, is what is going to be the best use of my time, right? Yeah. How much do I need this money? How much do I need this expertise? How much is this the right brand for me to be partnering with to make it worth either fighting through a giant contract or like suggesting a much simpler one? Because a lot of what's in that fat contract has nothing to do with what could go wrong with a startup. So you kind of have to probe and test and see what's going to make the most sense. And sometimes you walk away, right? Same way you would walk away from a really predatory VC.
Right. Well, and this is kind of the argument I've been making to startups for a long time, which is like, you don't need salespeople, you need biz dev people, because there's very few types of roles or companies or services right now where like just boots on the ground type of thing is going to move the needle on the business. There are some businesses, if you're working with Main Street, that can work pretty well for you comparatively. Right. But you're still like in the knowledge economy and you're working with corporates, because biz dev and sales has become very similar, because in the US we have so much option that really the differentiator is the experience of it, not really the product itself. And so experiential perspective, the nurturing of the relationship becomes part of the experience and how they think about like love versus not and so on. So all of a sudden that biz dev that was like a year-long timeline, and then you flip it over, becomes biz dev, or, is the timeline. And then the last 3 weeks is the sales guy being like, I'll help you with the contract and close the deal. And so to your point of like trying to look at your funnel from that perspective, but recognizing that they all require relationship, and right-sizing your approach to sales based on what corporates really require. Because I think the other thing people think is like, I'm going to go sell to corporates. I'm like, that thing's going to take like 3 months.
Right.
Like that contract's at least 3 months.
Yeah.
And no one's prepared for that timeline. And so to your point, when time is of the essence, if you're in a highly saturated environment and you're competing, how do you really going after folks that have more of an internal setup is a good signal for you.
It is. I do think you have to pay close attention to what that innovation group's job is. If you can figure out where that innovation group reports, that's really useful. Because sometimes the innovation group reports to marketing, and then you know that visibility is going to be really important to them. And I've seen an innovation group that reported to HR. I thought that was really interesting. So then you're probably going to have more access to employees than you would otherwise. If it reports to R&D, and that's what our conversation with Unilever is about, then you might actually make a difference in the product line. Yeah. Illumina Accelerator was accelerating its customers, not its acquisition targets. And there were very good reasons for that. It kept things very, very clean. It was always good to have Illumina on your cap table. They were never going to poison the well for anyone else. And so look at what it is that you can make inferences about what someone's trying to accomplish based on where they sit in the organization.
That's really, and actually the last one you said was interesting, because I never thought about the customer just basically being like, we're a pathway. So either we're adding you to our stack to give us revenue and give you a share, or vice versa. We're long tail in the journey, and that client becomes our client. That's a win for us too. And that's a very smart strategy, because it's a non-competitive, right? It's a completely
very clean
thing. Yeah, that's actually a great idea. And so let's talk a little bit about this upcoming podcast that you do have, talking about R&D and consumer goods. Just sneak peek into it, and really just like, what are the themes? Because I think the R&D thing is really messy for folks, and startups really don't know where they sit in the org. How should they be thinking about this topic?
I think you come in any door. What we've learned is that go in any door you can find. So someone with an innovation title can be a really good door. But if you have easier access to an engineer that you happen to know, or if you catch somebody at a conference, that's a great way to do it, right? And just learn what you can and work your way through to the right place. In the case of Unilever, they have something called Unilever Foundry. And they really are looking to partner with outside organizations at the heart of their R&D. So we're going to, I'll be learning a lot more about that on Tuesday myself. This conversation is part of, it's a free fireside chat series that we do as part of our small startup accelerator, which is called Click, the Startup Accelerator for Corporate Partnership. And we try to talk with one open innovation leader in corporate each month and then a second conversation with either a startup or someone who's a specialist in an area of interest. So what we've seen is that there are real differences between industries. And so this will be our first consumer goods conversations. And then there are real differences in how they do it. We've talked about accelerators. We've talked about CVC here just now in this conversation. And Unilever is a company.
What the acronym is for people who don't.
CVC, yes, corporate venture capital. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you. Always got to call people on the abbreviations and jargon. Thank you. So Unilever does multiple layers of things because they have multiple goals, as well they should, given that staying the course is risky, right? So and Darren Adams, who is our speaker on Tuesday, is a really thoughtful corporate open innovation person. He was actually one of the first folks I talked to about CAF in the early days. He was just joining Philips at that time, and now he's at Unilever. So that'll be a lot of fun.
I mean, I love staying. If staying the course is risky, going off the being path is risky. Basically everything is fraught with risk, and so you just have to.
Everything's fraught with risk. I'm sorry, it's like that, but it's important. It's valuable to be aware. Even though it's comfortable,
just change, right? Yeah, that's it. The only thing that's constant is change, right? And so I think it's just like that. The sooner we understand that collectively, the easier moving through it will be. I want to take a last couple minutes just because we didn't actually do the thing that we need to do here, which is talk just about CAF itself.
Yeah.
And what do you have a couple of different services? What do you offer? Can you share a little bit more about the org, kind of who you engage with, and what the goals are?
Yeah, absolutely. So we recently added the startup piece. We've talked about that. The core of it always has been working with startups that need to partner outside the organization, especially with startups. Sorry, did I say that right? Corporates who need to partner outside the organization, especially with startups. And I'll talk about three things that are sort of my favorites to offer right now. One is that we build programs, so Accelerator or Accelerator style experiences or partnership journey experiences. We can design the tactics that corporates need to execute on making these actually happen in a way that they can be accountable for. So there, if you've made a decision about what path you want to be on, we can help to design the path. We can show you how to do it. We can educate the staff and hand it over. We also really like to work on the strategic side. So for corporates who are just coming to this recognition that this is something that they need to do, we can help establish a coherent set of intentions and align the stakeholders so we don't run into so many of those confusions and breakdowns. So using the methods that we'll talk about in our book, Open Innovation Works, using those same practices on a consultancy journey. And then a third piece that I really love is building ecosystem experiences. And what that means is that we bring together stakeholders from who have different lenses on the same challenge, industry challenge or regional challenge. And we use all the learning sciences tools to create a room where people can get to the heart of a matter, get vulnerable enough quickly to get to the heart of a matter quickly, and emerge with plans and next steps. So we've done that with the materials industry. Companies in the materials industry. We've done that in Southern California as a region, and that there are many challenges where we tend to work in pairs across stakeholders and not as a group. And this is a practice that we've built that allows us to work across the group.
This is super interesting to me in the last minute we have here, this ecosystem building conversation. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about innovation at the ground level and how it impacts cities and states and how they think about becoming innovation centers and hubs. So when you're bringing folks together for ecosystem, how I'm sure there's a mix of ways it's happening, but you're basically working with like maybe one or two core stakeholders who have like, hey, we have a problem that we're trying to really resolve. So maybe material science, like we're dealing with some kind of massive shift in material or supply chain issue, I don't know, or in Southern California, we're dealing with some kind of climate issue, I don't know. And so we need to bring together some really bright minds around this and talk about how we can solve this together. What are the roadblocks in solving this problem, for example? And then you go out and you're like, we'll source the group and we'll facilitate the conversation to basically come out of a design thinking, meeting basically of like, here's a couple things we can do. And then they can kind of chart the course. And then you kind of work with them as a consultancy to help chart the course. Is that, I'm saying, I just read that out loud in my mind. I think it's
you can kind of imagine what it is, right? It's pretty commonsensical, but it's hard to do if you've never done it before. Yeah. And so we have ways of making it super visual. We have ways of making you experience great self-determination, even though we are actually sending you exactly where we want you to go. Yeah. We have we are very thoughtful about curating not just the people, but also the topics. We have ways of handing leadership over to people in the room, so that it feels very human and very efficient at the same time.
Well, it's very important work, because I think the last part of the little node that you just shared, which is like handing over leadership, because when you're bringing stakeholders together in this context, I mean, it's a little bit different than, I mean, it's like community organizing, but like a little bit on steroids, because
it really is.
You have politicians, you have corporates, and the egos and the attitudes and the beliefs and the, and making sure they all have a place on the stage, really. It's really an important part of the dance of decision making when it comes to those folks. And
and how to be on the stage if that's not a place you're used to, but we need your voice there. Preparing people so they can do that,
to move the needle and like unlock opportunity that's been basically stagnant, which you can look at a lot of things around the US and see those challenges. I mean, you can think about like everything is like obvious as like the wildfire problem in California compared to like whatever, like you can kind of dig, there's all these things where you're like, we have a stagnation of energy here. We don't know how to get through this blockage. And really it's a facilitation of a particular dance that has to happen really to unlock those things. And that's all the work, which is fascinating. And I think honestly also for companies, to think about that as well, because that also unlocks a lot of opportunity for them from a regulatory and participatory perspective in their ecosystem. I think that they sometimes miss out on, because they're kind of so used to lobbying for everything, that there's another collaborative way to do it.
Yes, exactly. This is the work, like you said.
This is the work. Exactly. So we are at time, so I don't want to take too much time, but any last thoughts you want to share for companies thinking about expanding their innovation efforts? Is there any advice you'd like to give?
Don't wait till you get it perfect. You will learn from trying whatever it is.
Yep. Accurate. Same. Wonderful. Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. This was so much fun.
Yes, it was wonderful. And so thank you everyone for listening and watching another episode of Accelerator Insider, where we go behind the scenes to talk to the creators of studios, labs, and accelerators, and how they're thinking about building businesses for today. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.